In this video, I'm going to talk about operant conditioning, paying particular attention to the 4 types of operant conditioning, as well as the 4 types of reinforcement schedules. Operant conditioning is a form of associative learning. However, it's a little different from the other type of associative learning, classical conditioning, which I covered in a different video. Operant conditioning is based on a law of effect. What that means is that people tend to engage in behaviors more often that lead to some kind of benefit, and they tend to avoid behaviors that have some kind of bad outcome. So basically, operant conditioning is associating a behavior with the benefit or consequence of that behavior in some way. Because of this, I like to think of operant conditioning as being a little bit more active of a process than classical conditioning. What I mean is that with classical conditioning, we're not really aware of that process of acquisition. However, with operant conditioning, we tend to pay more attention to it and have more of an active role in choosing to do a behavior or choosing not to do a behavior because of the consequences. The person most associated with operant conditioning is a psychologist named B.F. Skinner. Skinner performed many experiments and studies on animal behavior and then began to apply the findings from those studies to humans. One of the most famous experiments that he did involved placing rats in crates that were called Skinner boxes. These Skinner boxes usually had buttons or levers that the rats would interact with and either get a reward or punishment based on their actions or even their inactions. As I go through the different types of operant conditioning, I'll reference them back to these original experiments involving the rats and their Skinner boxes, but also be sure to give you plenty of real-world examples as well. There are 4 types of operant conditioning. They can be divided up into punishments and reinforcements. A punishment is anything that discourages a behavior. They're meant to decrease the likelihood of a behavior. Reinforcements are the opposite. They're meant to encourage a behavior. Both punishment and reinforcement can further be divided between positive and negative. So the 4 types of operant conditioning are positive punishment, positive reinforcement, negative punishment, and negative reinforcement. This is a good time to be clear that when you hear positive and negative in this kind of context, many people assume it to mean good and bad. Please be very careful though, because the terms positive and negative in operant conditioning aren't meant to imply good or bad. They're meant to show whether a stimulus is being added, which would make it positive, or taken away, which would make it negative. One trick I always tell my students is to not even write out the words negative and positive, but rather to use an addition and a subtraction symbol. That way you understand that something's being added or something's being removed. So let's start by talking about positive punishment. With positive punishment, something is being added in order to diminish a behavior. In Skinner's experiments, the rats in the Skinner boxes would have a lever that they could press. Usually when a rat was placed in the Skinner box, they would start exploring their new home. As they were doing this, if they happened to press that lever that was present in the box, the grating underneath them would give them a shock. So the rats learned pretty quickly not to press the lever because when they did, they got shocked. In this experiment, it's positive punishment because the behavior, which is pressing the lever, was decreased based upon a stimulus being applied, which was the rats being shocked. An example of this from the real world can be something as simple as a child misbehaving in a classroom and being disciplined by the teacher. You do have to be careful though, because we think of positive punishment as being a euphemism, but in psychology, positive punishment can be applied to pretty severe forms of punishment as well. So imagine a young kid writing with a marker on the wall of their house. The parent sees them and just starts beating the heck out of the kid. In terms of operant conditioning, that would also be called positive punishment. I'm giving this as an example to help you remember that positive here does not mean good. It doesn't mean something you should do. I'm also not saying that's positive punishment because a parent should beat the heck out of their kid. It's positive because something is being done, is being added to decrease a behavior, which is the kid writing on the wall. With positive reinforcement, something is being added to increase or encourage a behavior. With Skinner's rats, every time the rat would press the lever in the Skinner box, they would receive a pellet of food. The behavior of the rat pressing the lever is being encouraged by rewarding them with a treat, which is what makes it positive. In the real world, we can see positive reinforcement with, say, a parent encouraging their kid to be courteous by giving them praise. Sometimes we see this with school kids, especially very young school kids, where a teacher may have a board in the classroom, and every time a student does something right, like answer a question or be respectful, they're allowed to come up and select a sticker and put it by their name. I remember my first grade teacher having something like this, but I don't really remember my name having a lot of stickers next to it. Negative punishment involves taking something away to decrease a behavior. So let's go back to the kid who wrote with the marker on the wall at his house. Instead of the parent committing a felony on that kid, let's say the parent puts the child in timeout. They get sent to their room without any toys or games. That would be an example of negative punishment. The reason why this would be called negative punishment is because you're taking something away from the child. In this case, it would be their freedom, their ability to do things that they want to do in order to discourage a behavior. This is also another confusing example where students will often get negative and positive confused with good and bad. Because when you hear negative punishment, you think of it sounding like something that's bad, something that you don't want. But the example I gave sounds like something you should do. So again, please don't get the negative and positive confused with good and bad here, because it's only going to confuse you. The last type of operant conditioning we're going to talk about is negative reinforcement. And this also tends to be one of the ones that confuse people quite a bit. With negative reinforcement, we're talking about taking something away to encourage a behavior. This is the reason why it may seem confusing, because we think of something being taken away as being bad. However, with negative reinforcement, what is being taken away is usually something that is annoying, uncomfortable, or unpleasant. For example, in Skinner's experiments with the rats would be placed in the Skinner box, and the grating would be permanently electrified. So the rats were being shocked pretty much all the time. If the rat happened to press the lever in the box, the electrical current would stop. So it didn't take the rats very long to become very close friends with that lever. And they would spend the whole time leaning on the lever, because as soon as they let go, they'd start being shocked again. This may sound extreme, but there are examples of negative reinforcement in everyday life. For example, today I woke up to my alarm clock going off. The alarm clock functions off of a negative reinforcement cycle. The annoying sound of the alarm goes away when you engage in the behavior. So in this case, me waking up is the behavior. When that happens, I can turn off the alarm, so that's the negative because it's removing that stimuli. Another example of negative reinforcement is the seatbelt alarm that many people have in their cars. You get in your car, you turn on the ignition, and you hear that annoying alarm that keeps going off until you put on your seatbelt. The behavior is you wearing your seatbelt. When you do that, the annoying stimulus of that seatbelt alarm stops. So that's what makes it negative. It's important to remember that we use all four types of operant conditioning. There isn't one that's necessarily better than the others. Generally speaking though, positive reinforcement tends to be preferred for modifying behaviors. However, all four of the different operant learning styles can play an important role in shaping our overall behavior. Now that we've talked about the different types of operant conditioning, I want to move on and talk about the different types of reinforcement schedules. Just like there are 4 types of operant conditioning, there are 4 types of reinforcement schedules. Reinforcement schedules typically are applied to positive reinforcement. They refer to when and how often a reinforcement is given. The 4 types of reinforcement schedules can be divided into intervals and ratios. An interval means that you are given a reinforcement based on time. A ratio means that you are given a reinforcement based on some kind of action, based on you actually doing something. Both can be further divided into fixed and variable. Fixed means that you are given the reinforcement based on a consistent basis. Variable means that you are given the reinforcement on a changing basis that is not consistent. So the 4 types of reinforcement schedules are fixed interval, fixed ratio, variable interval, and variable ratio. Just like I did with the types of operant conditioning, I'm going to describe each of these reinforcement schedules and give you examples of them in everyday life. I'll start with fixed intervals. A fixed interval means that you are given a reinforcement based on a consistent time frame. This is something that most people are actually pretty familiar with. If you get paid every 2 weeks, then you are given a fixed interval. This is different from, say, somebody who makes money solely off commission. Somebody who gets paid solely off commission is being paid based on a fixed ratio. So for example, if I'm a farm worker and I get paid to go out in the field and pick oranges, even though me and my buddy spent 8 hours in the field picking oranges, if I pick 3 bushels of oranges and he picks 4, he's going to be paid more than me even though we spent the same amount of time in that field. That's what makes it a fixed ratio. You're not getting paid for how long it takes you to do something. You're just getting paid based on you actually doing something. So it may take you 8 hours to pick 4 bushels of oranges, but if another person only took 4 hours for them to pick 4 bushels, you're both going to be paid the same amount of money. Even though it may be confusing, if you get paid based on a time frame, like an hourly wage, or you get paid bi-weekly, it is not considered a fixed ratio because even though you are doing things during that time frame, you're really being paid based more off time than what you're actually doing. A great example of this that I'm sure all of us can relate to in some way is if you're working an hourly job like at a fast food restaurant. You're getting paid the same amount of money as a coworker, but if that coworker decides to do the bare minimum and you are picking up the slack, you're both getting paid the exact same amount because you're being paid for the time you spend there, not necessarily off what you do. Another example of this is if you work at, say, a fast food restaurant, you may have some days that are way busier than others, but you get paid the same regardless of how busy you are. I see that as a professor. There are certainly some weeks during my classes that are busier than others, but I get paid the same amount. The variable reinforcement schedules are a little bit more tricky. A variable interval is where you get a reinforcement based on a time frame that isn't consistent. It is changing. A good example of a variable interval is something like checking your phone for text messages or checking your email. Most people check their email or their phones for text messages randomly. If they're more bored, they may check more often than if they're not. However, you getting an email or a text is not based on you checking your phone, which would be a ratio. I can check my phone 5 times in a few minutes, but that doesn't guarantee that I'm going to get a text message or an email. What makes this variable is the fact that it also isn't based on a consistent time. After all, it isn't like you get a text message or an email every 5 minutes a day like clockwork. It's random. One thing that's interesting is that the variable reinforcement schedules can tend to have more of an addictive influence on us. Because it's unexpected, we tend to anticipate it more often than things that are expected. This is one reason why doing things like checking social media sites, checking your phone, your emails, can tend to be more of an addictive behavior. Also, the more emails or text messages we get, the more we're going to increase that behavior of checking our phones or emails. This addictive pull is especially obvious when we talk about a variable ratio type of reinforcement schedule. A variable ratio is one where you receive the reinforcement based on an inconsistent number of actions. One of the best examples of this is gambling. So something like doing scratch-off lottery tickets. It's a ratio because you have to do something. You have to buy the ticket. You have to scratch it off. However, it's variable because there isn't a fixed number of tickets you need to buy to guarantee that you get that reinforcement. You may be lucky and win off that very first lottery ticket that you buy. Or you may scratch off lottery tickets for years and years and never win anything. There's no guarantee. But because you don't know, you're always thinking that the next one could be the jackpot winner. And that's why it can be very addictive. One way in which all the different types of operant conditioning and reinforcement schedules can be applied is through a therapy called Applied Behavior Analysis, or ABA. ABA is frequently used in a variety of settings, especially with children that have autism. In fact, ABA is one of the preferred treatments to help children with autism. However, it's used in other settings as well. The goal of ABA is to use the different types of operant conditioning and reinforcement schedules to help shape a person's problematic behaviors. Shaping is an important concept with operant conditioning. It implies that more complex behaviors like social skills or language skills have to be broken up into steps along the way. You can think of it as that saying about needing to crawl before you can walk. Well, shaping is the process of breaking down more complex behaviors with small little baby steps that you can take along the way. Generally speaking, the more complex the target behavior, the longer it will take to shape the behavior and the more steps you may have to go through along the way. While ABA is a great example of shaping being done to improve a person's behavior, not all shaping is done based on ABA or to improve a person's behavior. Throughout these videos, I always try to make connections between terms and concepts we're learning and everyday experiences people have and know about. With that being said, a great example of how behaviors can be shaped with operant conditioning comes from a phenomenon that is unfortunately very common. Addiction is a direct result of operant conditioning shaping a person's behavior. Specifically, addiction can be the result of negative reinforcement. Say that I'm a person that is dealing with a lot of stress and anxiety, but when I smoke marijuana, I feel less stressed and less anxious. This is negative reinforcement in action. Something unpleasant is being removed, the stress, the anxiety, when I engage in the behavior of smoking marijuana. The shaping that usually comes from addiction is by slowly changing a person's behavior over time. Maybe at first it can be just an occasional use of a substance, but slowly the person becomes more and more dependent on that substance and less able to manage their lives without the substance being used. What's interesting is that a lot of rehab facilities use ABA and operant conditioning, among other treatments, to help addicts recover. If you're enjoying content like this, please be sure to subscribe to my channel and give me a like with the thumbs up icon below. This helps me to continue to expand these videos and provide amazing content to all my viewers. Thanks for watching, everybody.